Hello again and welcome to another edition of FaithWorks. By now you're getting used to the idea that on this program I have the privilege of always speaking with, conversing with a person whose work is based on faith and whose faith is very much their life's work, their passion, their commitment, their career, often enough. We've had recently Sister Helen Prejean, and today, believe it or not, someone who is going to speak about Sister Helen because in his line of work, people like Helen come up. Mm-hmm. Our guest today is Dr. Scott KLINE, and Dr. KLINE comes to us from near Toronto at St. Jerome's University, University of Waterloo. He'll explain how this is a very important structure in Canadian academia. What he does there as a Catholic theologian is share his understanding of Catholic ethic, justice, the principles of our thinking and feeling about the human person, society, politics, contemporary issues, and all of these topics that are so important for us in our world. Scott, it's great to have you here. And the first thing you could do is tell us, how did we ever get you to be here today from Toronto?
Yeah, well, let me say it is a pleasure to be with you. I've been in Fresno now. This is my second visit. I originally came to Fresno in August of 2015, and the reason why I was coming was to look at the homeless situation and approaches to homelessness in Fresno. I came across Jim Nelson in trying to sort of organize my visit, and Jim took the opportunity, as I think Jim does periodically, to say, hey, why don't you come and be a part of our homeless summit sometime in the winter or spring of 2016. I said, well, Jim, let me know, see how that goes, and we chatted back and forth, and yeah, it's my pleasure to be a part of the homeless summit.
And what did you share with this group that was from many different churches, faith-based communities, and non, people that are working with the homeless? It was held at St. Therese. What did you work with them on, Scott? What was your basic thrust of conversation and your presentation?
Yeah, well, I'm in a research team with Dr. Megan Shore, who also happens to be my wife, so we're a wonderful team.
You know, very nice. I noticed you're working with someone, and to think she's your wife, congratulations.
She is my wife. We work extremely well together. So she's at a social justice and peace studies department at King's University College in Western Ontario, and I'm a religious studies professor. Long story short, about 3 years ago, we started working on homelessness research. I just become a chair of a non-for-profit organization called Project Plowshares, and it's an agency of the Canadian Council of Churches that focuses on peace and disarmament. And I'd also been working with Citizens for Public Justice in Canada. And so there was a kind of natural progression that I was becoming interested in homelessness, and we have contacts down in Florida. And it was really in Florida, in St. Petersburg, where we began to be interested in approaches to homelessness. Because we are people of faith, and because we are at Catholic universities, and because I'm a social ethicist, we always, what is the role of the faith-based organization? Ministries, the churches, things, places like Catholic Charities, organizations like Catholic Charities, St. Vincent de Paul, and what are they doing? In the last 15 to 20 years, homelessness has undergone a real sort of revolution on how we're treating it. Gone are the days of shelters where you would basically round up groups of people living on the street and you stick them in a shelter, and it was a very horrible situation. The term warehousing comes out of this, where you just simply move people off the street and you kind of incarcerate them. So we'd moved away from that as a society, both in Canada and in the United States. And over the last 5 to 10 years, there's a growing recognition that if you're going to deal with the holistic problem of homelessness, then you have to treat it holistically. And what this led to is what's called a systems approach to homelessness. And basically what a systems approach to homelessness is, it's any response that integrates service delivery, design of the structure around how you're going to treat homelessness. It brings together people who are involved in housing resources, and basically everything that you can imagine relating to homelessness. And it tries to coordinate and integrate everything that's going on. Obviously, one of the key players in this is faith-based organizations. Almost since time immemorial, you can go to the Gospel of Matthew, and there we're told as Christians that you're supposed to feed the hungry, you provide drink to the thirsty, and do those kinds of things. And for years, we've been doing this as Christians, as people of faith. But honestly, it's probably not enough. And what a number of organizations, Christian organizations that are involved in homeless outreach and so on, they've found themselves in these systems, working with people who are not faith-based. They don't come from the same places. They don't have the same moral foundations. Oftentimes, in fact, they're government. The case we looked at in St. Petersburg, Florida, in fact, is the lead agency is actually the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office.
Oh, wow.
So basically what we're trying to figure out is, how do faith-based organizations interact? How do they talk to each other? How do they get together, work with organizations for which they have really no other sort of point of contact other than that they are trying to so-called solve the homeless problem, how you abolish homelessness, how you get to zero homelessness. That's a long answer to a very complex question, actually.
Because it's exactly why you're here.
Yep.
And why Jim and the committee thought, if we can land Scott to do this, it'll be such a boost in energy. It's the 8th summit already. There's been other times, but this one wants to address it in a very positive way.
Yeah.
And what would be something that I would say would be one of your hopes? What would be maybe a long-range hope that you would have after this summit that you were keynoting at?
Yeah, I think, well, two things. One is that I'm an advocate for a systems approach. And the reason why the systems approach is so important is that it seeks to address some of the problems that we have, that over time there's a kind of patchwork approach that develops, where you have a lot of well-intended people, a lot of well-intended organizations. They do their thing, and over time they grow organically, but they don't really talk to each other all the time. We have coalitions and we have alliances, but they're somewhat informal. That leads to redundancy. It leads to inefficiencies. But again, people are doing great work individually, so that's not the issue. The question is, how do we combine our efforts? How do we consolidate efforts and work collaboratively to address, as a group within the system, homelessness? So that's the first thing. I think the systems approach is absolutely 100% where we ought to be. Second thing is that one of the things I hope that people will got out of my talk and will get out of my research that I'm doing, is that as people of faith, we need to engage others in collaborative efforts. And this is risky. And I think there's a number of reasons why it's risky, but I'll give you one real example. A lot of faith-based organizations feel very threatened when you enter into what is essentially a secular system. Questions about your identity, questions about your mission start to creep in. You might have organizations say, well, that's not our mission to do this. And to me, that actually is, it's understandable, first of all. But if there are ways that congregations, if there are, boards of, of faith-based organizations that can support this kind of work, I think collaboratively we are far stronger to solve this problem of homelessness. And it's not an easy thing, because it is so complex that you actually need to bring all these people together. One last point. I think as people of faith who've been working with homeless populations in the past, it's very easy to get down in the weeds, and that's, again, totally understandable, is that we're so busy, putting people into shelters, we're housing them, we're feeding them, we're trying to move them, individually from a place of, a very dark place into, a more permanent place, getting back into the community. What's lost is the ability to see sometimes what those actions are doing to change the culture. And one of the benefits of being a part of a system is that it invites you into a larger conversation, and you begin to see the results of your very individualized sort of micro actions. You get to see the macro picture. And that, we've seen, is really, it's inspiring for a number of faith-based organizations. So there is that fear of loss of identity again, but once they see that the outcomes of what they're doing, where you actually have municipalities and you have people, businesses working together to combat homelessness, that's a wonderful thing.
I just want to bring up somebody that we're all thinking of right now, let's say Pope Francis.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that he has, as an individual, done beautiful acts that are very much enlightening people as to the
Yes.
right behavior. Is there something also that you would note for us, how he is also very much wanting to address, as you would say, the systems?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just help this single person. Would there be something from Pope Francis that you as a scholar have also noticed beyond just the behavior, but his writing and the way he actually personifies a systems approach?
Yeah.
Do you see it?
I do. And and the thing you can't lose in a systems approach is the individual. And we can do this in theology too. We can talk about such things as social sin, that there are structural oppression, there are structures out there that will actually dehumanize us. Some elements of the economy, the way that we treat people who've committed crimes. You referenced Sister Helen Prejean. You look at the way that money is spent on arms trade, for example. All of these are dehumanizing, potentially dehumanizing and death-dealing institutions. And Pope Francis understands this. He's fully aware of that. He's also very good on the individual touch. So some of the things that he does to reach out to immigrants and to migrants, he's addressing the individual at his or her level. But in the process, he's also making a larger argument about systems of injustice. So he's wanting to do a both-and approach to a very practical theology.
On that note, having not solved homelessness, but finding out a systems approach to that issue, we're going to take our little break, and when we're back, Dr. KLINE will share with us some other items and issues that he is dealing with both professionally, personally, and academically. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome to the second part of our program, FaithWorks, this month, with Dr. Scott KLINE, coming to us from St. Jerome's and the University of Waterloo. But tell us a little bit about that system you have in Canada, where there is a tremendous appreciation for Catholic academia in a secular collaborative, very much a systems approach. Tell
Yeah.
us about your school.
Well, it's certainly a different system. In Canada, in Ontario, the province of Ontario in particular, Catholic schools are publicly funded, unlike the United States where they're privately funded. I'm at St. Jerome's University in the University of Waterloo. Waterloo is a major research university. It has about 40,000 students, and there are 5 what's called church colleges there. So it's very similar to the British model. So if you went to Oxford or Cambridge, you would go to all the little, the smaller colleges that make up the larger university. So St. Jerome's is one of those universities. It is the largest sort of university within the university. We register about 1,000 students. We will teach per year about 8,000 to 10,000 students. And it's really it's a kind of interesting relationship. The vast majority of students in our classes are not Catholic. They're actually students who will come from the University of Waterloo and take our courses. So
Nice.
I'll teach a course on, say, Christian sexual ethics or Catholic ethics. And 60–70% of the class will be non-Catholic or more. So it's really an amazing, opportunity to speak in a very ecumenical way to people who don't necessarily share your faith, but might share some of the humanistic ideals of the Catholic social tradition or the Catholic intellectual tradition. So it's really wonderful.
Oh,
arrangement.
it sounds beautiful to have that
Yeah.
symbiotic relationship
Yep.
with high scholarship. Now
Yeah.
let's talk about scholarship here. You're an American who decided to learn German, go to Germany. Tell us about your academic career, which led you up to Canada and Gregory Baum. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yes, the long and winding road to Gregory Baum. Well, I grew up Catholic. My parents were Catholic converts, and when I was in 4th or 5th grade, I started going to church, and it was a little church in Missouri, and this would have been the 1970s, and God love them. I mean, they did their best. I will say that I'm not sure they realized that the Second Vatican Council actually took place. I remember a lot of Latin. I remember incense everywhere. I remember bells. And I'll tell you what, I fell in love with it. I mean, as a young boy, it triggered something in me. So religion and politics and history has always been something that's been a part of me ever since I was a young boy. That's the way it is. So I went to university, not a Catholic university, just to a state university, actually to play baseball.
What position did you
I was a catcher.
Awesome.
There's not much future for a weak hitting catcher who has an average arm and is only 5'7". But anyway.
But career in theology,
Career
yes.
in theology, yes. That's an option. So sort of cutting to the chase, I ended up doing a master's in church history, and not theology, it was more church history and Christian thought. And I became enamored with the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and got interested in the confessing church in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, started reading Karl Barth, started reading about some of the Catholic bishops that were responding, and obviously sort of papal politics and so on. So I became just completely enamored with all of this. After my master's degree, it was at the University of Kansas, I applied for a scholarship to study in Germany. Got the scholarship, ended up at the University of Heidelberg, and was there for a year. And I actually intended to do work with a Lutheran theologian and ethicist by the name of Wolfgang Huber, who became the Bishop of Berlin-Brandenburg while I was there. So, but when you're at the University of Heidelberg, you're kind of in the center of German theology back in the 1990s. And so, I had an opportunity to meet, Jürgen Moltmann, Wolfhard Pannenberg, and a number of other scholars from Tübingen and Munich and on. So it's just this wonderful opportunity. And it was while I was at the University of Heidelberg that I decided to apply to work with Dr. Gregory Baum at McGill University in Montreal. So from Heidelberg, I went to Montreal and started studying with Gregory, and that was in 1994. And the day I met Dr. Baum, Gregory, I was kind of lost a little bit, and I said, you know, I would like to work with you. And I said, he goes, well, what would you like to work on? I said, well, I would like to work on sort of ecumenical theology. I'm interested in the church in East Germany. And Gregory being Gregory, he reaches down into the bottom drawer of his desk. He pulls out a manuscript, throws it across his desk at me. He says, here's a manuscript I've just written on the church in East Germany. So he says, we'll talk about it in the morning.
Wow.
So we were off to a good start.
And since then, you're able, right now, you translate Moltmann, you do contemporary theology, you do ethics. What would be something that you could share, maybe around the issue of church in politics, or a social ethic that the church needs to maintain, and then why don't you bridge into culture wars? Any of that you'd like to touch on, Scott?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I just wrote a chapter in a book called Faith Matters in Politics. It's published by Novalis Press. The editor is a former member of Parliament, a man by the name of John Malloy, and I have a chapter in there called Telling Religion to Shut Up. Well, I didn't choose the title, but it was very provocative, and I like that. So what the little chapter is about is, what is the relationship between religion and the state? What role does religion have when it speaks in the public sphere? And I think the larger question is that how are people of faith and organizations, Christian organizations, to speak in the public sphere? In Canada, it's a major issue. In Canada, we declare ourselves to be a multicultural society. We do have a very strong history of secularism. In Quebec, we have laïcité, which is more of the French version, which some would say is really hostile to religion. Whereas in the rest of Canada, it's more of the British model, where secularism is actually a kind of Protestant secularism, which we would be very familiar with in the United States, where it sounds something like this, that, you know, it's, as people of faith, we don't really necessarily want to involve ourselves in politics because we don't want somebody else trying to force themselves on us. So we basically agree that there is this sort of public square out there where you can, you know, have all sorts of arguments, and you somewhat leave your faith behind, but you can use it to energize your position, your moral foundations, and so on. So part of what I'm trying to do in that is, in this little chapter, is, you know, combat what I think is a real it's a distorted discourse around culture wars, where what we find in the media and in politics is that we find these hot button issues, whether it's around sexuality, end of life, or whatever, and then those get ramped up to such a degree that I begin to question on whether these are actually theological arguments or you know, arguments that the church ought to be having, or whether these are arguments that are being driven for political purposes. You know, fundamentally, are these not wedge issues that divides, you know, Republicans from Democrats in the United States, or political, you know, conservatives and liberals and the NDP in Canada? So you gotta kind of wonder, because the culture wars sells. I mean, pundits make, you know, a lot of money off of continuing the culture wars, and I think the culture wars have been actually better for pundits than it's been for the church. So,
since you are an ethicist, would you want to help us in the final minutes that we have, Scott, to even clarify what is ethics the way you would want to present it, and Catholic ethics? Is there a Catholic ethic?
yeah, there is. I get asked this quite a lot. I mean, the Catholic moral and ethical tradition is certainly one that is inherited. It comes out of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. There's very little question about that. But what is unique is the way that the Catholics will engage in argumentation. I mean, the old quad of, you got text, you got scripture, you've got tradition, you have reason and experience. Catholics understand that sort of the two primary ways that we engage in moral authorities is that you need scripture to found your argument, but you also need a very rich historical tradition to help interpret that. Whereas, a Protestant ethic might be more, let's focus, always go back to the text. There are some traditions, obviously, that will say that the text is very literal, and, you continually go back to it. Catholics will do the same thing. Coming out of the Second Vatican Council, there was this renewed emphasis on the importance of learning how to interpret the text, interpret Scripture. And so we do this as Catholic ethics, as Catholic ethicists. We also go to the tradition. So we will read encyclicals, papal exhortations, and all the way back to Pope Peter, right? So that's a part of the rich resources that we have in the Catholic tradition. Then obviously you have reason. Reason is in Catholic morality, it's supposed to be a reasonable thing. Yes, there are miracles. Yes, we need to pray, absolutely, but ultimately, what we do, what we say we ought to do, how we ought to live, should be a rational thing. And then finally, there's experience. And so, as people of conscience, if we start prescribing a way forward, and this is how we ought to live. If it doesn't ring true with our experience, you keep asking the question. You go back and you say, okay, well, if it doesn't ring true with our experience, it doesn't fit with where my conscience is. Let's go back and reinterpret Scripture. Let's go back and rethink our tradition. Let's go back. And so it's a constant loop. And to me, that's the heart of the Catholic social tradition. It's a living tradition.
I can't thank Dr. Scott KLINE enough for having figured out a little window of time that he could be with us today, coming all the way from outside of Toronto to be here in Fresno for a homeless summit. We began talking in the first half of the program about homelessness and a systems approach to issues like homelessness. Then in the second half, we were able to see how he would have come to such a conclusion as that with his academic background and his understanding of what is a Catholic ethic. It includes so much more than just a text or just what they said to do. It's incarnating an experience that resonates with the Scripture and with our own person. On that note, I thank Scott. Hope to see you next month for another issue of FaithWorks. Till then, God bless.